The Israelis had a target, the man who apparently inherited the leadership of Hamas from his deceased brother. For that, the soldiers engaged in combat in Gaza, fighting in tight buildings, trying to survive ambushes. The enemies lurked, set traps after luring the soldiers into their territory. Many of them didn't even know what they were walking into, only to experience the horror of one of Hamas's fire ambushes. Meanwhile, Israeli intelligence searched for its target, finding Hamas leaders still alive and eliminating them one by one in pursuit of the main target. The blood shed in the few kilometers between the Egyptian border and the Lebanese border is disproportionate to the size of the territory. There a war was taking place that, in the context of the last 3 years, could be said to have started when Hamas came up with what it considered to be the perfect plan: a surprise attack against southern Israel on October 7, 2023, taking advantage of the situation to murder the elderly, women, and children. Hamas filmed it, Hamas celebrated. They filmed kidnapped children, now orphans of parents whom they themselves killed in their homes. The bloody terrorist act gave justification for Netanyahu's government to start the invasion of Gaza in a disproportionate war that in just a few months led to tens of thousands of deaths amid so many bombings. Gaza was swept by bombs, with entire cities turning into a plain of rubble, sand, and death. Hamas continued its war, using civilian clothes to blend in with the population, apparently showing little concern for the problems it could cause by camouflaging itself among civilians. Their military uniforms only miraculously reappeared at the beginning of 2025, when there was finally a ceasefire and the exchange of hostages. Yes, it was with pomp, uniforms on display, and filming that Hamas released some malnourished captives, people who didn't even know their family members had been killed and talked about reuniting with them. Or even corpses of women and children displayed in a morbid show. Fortunately, some relief came with this ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, mediated by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar. It came into effect on January 19, 2025, with the goal of ending 15 months of war. In the first phase, Hamas was supposed to release 33 Israeli captives, prioritizing living children, civilian women, the elderly, and female soldiers, followed by wounded or sick civilian men under 50 years old. If the number of living individuals was less than 33, the bodies of deceased Israelis would make up the difference. In exchange, Israel was supposed to release up to 1,904 Palestinian prisoners, including 737 serving life sentences. Israel was also required to allow 608 trucks per day, 300 for the north, including 50 fuel trucks for power plants, trade, debris removal, and operations of hospitals and bakeries. But before the agreement was completed, both sides were already exchanging accusations. On March 1st, Hamas rejected an Israeli proposal to extend the first phase of the ceasefire that prioritized living children, civilian women, and elderly people over female soldiers. They insisted on moving on to the second phase, which included the complete withdrawal of the remaining Israeli soldiers from the Gaza Strip. Netanyahu's cabinet stated that Israel endorsed a United States plan to extend the truce, but Hamas refused. On March 2nd, Israel stopped the entry of aid into Gaza, which the mediators condemned as a violation. On March 9th, Israel cut off the electricity supply to Gaza. On March 18, 2025, according to some sources, Israel launched extensive surprise airstrikes on Gaza, breaking the ceasefire with Hamas. Netanyahu declared that Israel had resumed full-scale combat against Hamas in Gaza, stating that the airstrikes were just the beginning in response to Hamas's refusal to release hostages and extend the ceasefire. In fact, the war was about to escalate. Israel had its targets clearly defined. The leadership of Hamas would continue to fall to bombs and gunfire. At that time, the heir to Hamas, Mohammed Sinwar, was one of their main targets. Sinwar joined Hamas in 1991, becoming part of the military wing, the Al-Qassam Brigades. Ideologically influenced by Abdel Aziz al-Hantizi, the co-founder of the group, he rose through the ranks and became one of the military chiefs, getting close to leaders like Mohammed Daif and Marwan Issa, who were killed by Israel during the war. According to the Israelis, Sinwar allegedly persuaded the group Ansar Bait al-Maqdis, linked to Al-Qaeda, to join the Islamic State, forming the Sinai province. In exchange for the safe delivery of weapons to Gaza, Hamas provided the group with training and weaponry. Israeli intelligence believes that Mohammed Sinwar was one of the main architects of the attack led by Hamas on October 7, 2023. As a result, he became one of the most wanted targets by Israel, which offered a reward of $300,000 for information about his whereabouts. With the approval of Mohammed Daif, Sinwar oversaw the creation of Hamas's Shadow Unit, a secret elite force responsible for protecting prisoners considered valuable. It was no wonder, therefore, that he was so sought after and considered one of the heirs to the leadership vacuum left by the death of his brother and so many important leaders like Mohammed Daif. Since the death of Yahya Sinwar, the Israeli leadership has focused its efforts on identifying and eliminating new Hamas commanders. Sinwar was not just a leader. He was one of the architects of the group's security apparatus and one of the most influential figures within the Palestinian organization. His strategic role made him the mastermind behind the October 7, 2023 attack, the most devastating in decades. His absence left a gap and prompted a race by Israel to prevent his successor from reorganizing Hamas. Shin Bet, one of Israel's intelligence agencies operating in Gaza, aimed to locate Mohammed Sinwar, brother of Yahya Sinwar. But until then, there were many other Hamas leaders whose movements Shin Bet managed to track so that the Israel Defense Forces could put a permanent end to their activities. In December 2024, a bomb descended on the Khan Yunis area, lighting up the night and taking the lives of 20 Hamas soldiers who were gathered there. Secondary explosions were heard, indicating that there was an ammunition depot at the site. At least 20 people died, with Palestinian authorities claiming that many of them were actually civilians. The fire burned for a long time. The bombs also did their part in Jabalia. The Israeli Defense Forces stated that an airstrike in Jabalia resulted in the death of Hansen Jabda, a Hamas company commander, as well as Zaha Shahab and Ali Ramadan, all of whom were involved in the October 7th attack. According to the military, 2 other Hamas commanders were also killed in the same offensive. In another operation, Muhammad Hamouda, who also took part in the October 7th attack, was killed in a separate strike. According to the Israel Defense Forces, 5 more Hamas members died along with him. Hamas tried to resist during this period. Ambushes were set up with improvised explosives. Cameras scattered among the ruins waited for the arrival of Israeli soldiers, always watched by stealthy eyes that knew how to walk among the rubble of the battlefield. The bomb was detonated when 3 of them were in the exact spot. The fire tore through the opposing soldiers, bringing some of them down with serious injuries. Support arrived to take the wounded away, but the pursuit of Hamas continued. The Israelis had greater firepower, but they were vulnerable to surprises as they searched the houses and apartments where Hamas was hiding. Danger lurked behind every door. It was all too easy to get shot while trying to look inside a room. From there, Hamas would simply toss grenades to force the enemies back. Sometimes that retreat was chaotic due to injuries or a terrified soldier who, in his panic, turned his back to the enemy, allowing Hamas to have all the firepower. The Israeli rolled down the stairs, wounded, with his reason and training killed by fear. His comrades tried to help, but the whole squad was disorganized. Taking advantage of an opening, the Hamas militant threw a grenade that exploded in the heart of the formation, causing immediate damage. The soldiers tried to pull themselves together, but Hamas gunfire caused more confusion, with only one of them saving the group from something worse by keeping his composure in time for the others to retreat. Climbing the stairs made even the best trained soldiers break out in a cold sweat. The tips of the rifles searched for targets that could fatally surprise them with greater speed and precision in an ambush. The soldiers had to search for Hamas inside homes that still bore the marks of families who fled the war, leaving everything behind. You had to be careful for a grenade rolling across the floor. The soldiers retreated, but then the fighting started, destroying what was left of the apartment. The enemy was well defended inside the room. Even the grenades that exploded inside couldn't reach him. Soon others appeared and the Israelis regrouped in the corridors below, realizing that Hamas was in different positions. One of them tried to attack them by surprise, but the 5.56 ammunition went through his body, making a lifeless corpse fall down the stairs. The Givati Brigade eliminated Mohammed Abdal Ahmed Salah in one of these raids in Jabalia. He was with two other Hamas commanders who also took part in the October 7 terrorist attack. Shortly before the ceasefire in January 2025, the Shin Bet managed to locate the car of Rab Abu Atif, who served as the head of the terrorist organization in Tulkarm in the West Bank. Abu Atif took part in several shooting attacks, including one that happened on July 16, 2024 near the Hanin Junction when he opened fire on an Israeli vehicle, leaving 3 civilians wounded. Fired by the drone, it killed Atif and another Hamas member. But Shin Bet was still tracking its main target. Gaza and the West Bank were not the only places where Hamas operated. Some of them lived or fled to Lebanon with Mohammed Shaheen, who had been planning attacks from there against Israel. The Shin Bet identified him and the drone eliminated him with a precise strike. There was a brief pause in the deaths of Hamas leaders during the ceasefire in 2025, but Israeli intelligence did not stop looking for him. Mohammed Sinwar's movements were becoming clearer to the Shin Bet as Hamas kept losing more and more territory in Gaza after the ceasefire ended. Hamas snipers had two major advantages in their attacks against the Israelis. One was the heavy weapons, and the other was the ease of lurking, being able to spot enemy movement in such a dense area full of places to hide. Shots that didn't kill the enemy weren't regretted, because all they had to do was wait for help to arrive for the wounded, and another target would be exposed. One of the ways the Israelis fought this was by literally blowing up the buildings where the snipers were hiding. In one of these bombings, the commander of the Tel Sultan Battalion's sniper forces in southern Gaza was killed back in April of 2025. Simply calling Hamas a bunch of poorly armed terrorists was quite careless. That was a well-structured organization with substantial funding. It was their choice to operate without uniforms to appear like a disorganized resistance movement rather than a military group with foreign funding from countries like Qatar and Iran. Dressing as civilians was both propaganda and camouflage among the population, besides being good propaganda for less informed people. Meanwhile, they were making complex plans, observing the Israeli routes to set up ambushes for the armored columns. The traps were effective at destroying several armored vehicles. The Merkava tanks had good protection mechanisms, but they didn't work against explosives on the ground. In April, a mass grave was discovered with the bodies of several humanitarian aid volunteers to Gaza. Next to one of the bodies was a cell phone with footage of the incident, in which ambulances and a fire truck were surrounded in a shootout that ended with at least 20 dead. The Israelis claimed that there were at least 9 armed men among them, alleging that the footage showed one of them with a crowbar. But they also said that the vehicles were unmarked, which the footage contradicts. Despite the different versions or justifications, there was an admission that the deaths were caused by the Israelis. The Palestinians were surrounded in the middle of this massacre. Residents of the Gaza Strip revolted against Hamas and the continuation of the conflict. By that point, there was an estimate of more than 50,000 dead in Gaza, with more and more victims due to Israel's relentless bombings. Some people just like to blame the Israelis for the tragedy and considered Hamas a great victim fighting for the Palestinians. Contrary to what many thought, Hamas was far from being unanimously supported by the Palestinians. Residents of the Gaza Strip revolted against Hamas and the continuation of the conflict, demanding both an end to the war and the end of the group's control over the territory. The protests were driven by the population's exhaustion with the war and by dissatisfaction with the leadership of Hamas, which was accused of diverting humanitarian aid meant for civilians, suppressing freedom of speech and the press, and committing abuses against the Palestinian population itself. Later, videos emerged that apparently showed executions and punishments by Hamas against those who protested against alleged Israeli spies, or simply against those who, in desperation, tried to loot food. The population of Gaza continued to suffer amid these battles, being forced to search for bodies under the rubble while tears dried on hopeless faces. Hamas continued its resistance, waiting for the Israelis for more battles and ambushes inside the buildings. They hid in the passages of their tunnels, waiting for the soldiers to come with their drones and dogs to try to find them. Safe underground, the fighters blew up the building, killing at least 2 enemy soldiers. Inside those tunnels, they moved through Gaza, firing their RPGs at the tanks. Despite all the smoke, the truth was that many of the Merkavas remained intact thanks to their protection system, unlike the bulldozers that suffered from the attacks while Hamas hid again in the tunnels. But every time one of the Hamas squads was found organizing in a building, an airstrike would come from the sky to eliminate the problem. The powerful airstrikes left their mark on Gaza. Each explosive that came from the clouds made the scene more and more terrifying. A rocket launch position was hit so precisely that it detonated Hamas's ammunition, causing their projectiles to fly uncontrollably. But the tunnels remained Hamas's greatest weapon. They moved beneath Gaza, able to emerge discreetly, invisible to their targets. The Hamas soldiers calmly aimed at the Merkava tanks. Then they disappeared, blending the exit with the rubble to disguise the existence of the tunnels. This movement was too fast for the Israelis to react. When the troops from Tel Aviv found these tunnels, they investigated and traced their routes, sometimes noticing that the structures extended for more than a kilometer. In a region as dense as Gaza, it was obvious that they passed through residential areas. The engineering teams took care of destroying them shortly after. Finally, one of these tunnels was discovered by Shin Bet. The information revealed that Mohammed Sinwar was in a tunnel beneath the European Hospital of Gaza in Khan Yunis. Shin Bet organized to confirm the information. The planes were prepared, loading bombs already marked with names for death. Mohammed Sinwar had escaped other attacks, and the Israelis wanted to end his story now. The region was marked as the next target. The bombs began to fall on March 18, 2025. The explosion was devastating not only for Sima. Civilians near the hospital felt that impact. At first, Hamas denied the death of another one of its leaders. The Israelis entered the tunnels, showing the entire structure beneath the hospital. Inside were the bodies of Sinwar and some of his supporters. The bodies were removed for identification, which confirmed that the target was correct. Another leader dead. Terribly, about 20 people also died in the process. Hamas kept boasting about resisting, saying its cells would persist, but days later more bombs fell on Gaza. The Israel Defense Forces eliminated Mu'tazdib, who was responsible for Hamas's missile and rocket arsenal in the northern Gaza Strip. He had coordinated attacks against Israeli aircraft and the launching of drones against civilians. Thus, Hamas was terrorized by the deaths of its leaders, apparently without having the same fear of seeing so many Palestinians dying around them. The Israelis continued with their operation, taking more and more control over a destroyed Gaza, where their bombs had created shallow graves. The war would continue to stir passions with supporters on both sides, but there was no shield to protect children, women, and the elderly from fire and hunger.